I found out my husband was on a $35,000 luxury cruise with another woman. The same morning my 8-year-old son asked me why his dad didn't say goodbye. My name is Emily Carter, I'm 34 years old, and until recently, I thought I understood my life. Not perfect, not glamorous, but stable, predictable, safe. Daniel and I had been married for 10 years. We had routines, responsibilities, a mortgage, a son who still believed his dad was a hero. And maybe that was my first mistake, believing that routine meant security. Started with something small. It always does. A notification on our shared bank account. First, I didn't think much of it. Daniel handled most of our finances and I trusted him. I always had. But that morning something felt off. The charge wasn't just large. It was impossible to ignore. $35,000. I remember staring at the number, blinking like it might change if I looked long enough. It didn't. My hands felt cold as I tapped into the details. Travel. International. Luxury package. I frowned trying to make sense of it. We hadn't planned any trips. Not even close. Liam had school. I had work. Daniel had just told me 2 days ago that things were tight, that we needed to be careful with money. Careful. That word echoed in my head as I stood there in the kitchen. The morning light coming through the window. Everything looking normal except it wasn't. I called him. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. A quiet unease settled in my chest. The kind that doesn't scream but lingers, heavy and persistent. Then I did something I wish I hadn't, but also something I'll never regret. I opened social media. I don't even know why that thought crossed my mind. Maybe instinct. Maybe fear. Maybe something inside me already knew. It took less than 10 seconds. That's all it took for my entire world to tilt. There it was. A photo. Bright blue ocean. Endless sky. A massive cruise ship in the background. And in the center of it, Daniel. My husband. Wearing sunglasses I bought him last Christmas. Smiling. Relaxed. Like he didn't have a care in the world. And next to him her. A woman I had never seen before. Leaning into him like she belonged there. Like she had always belonged there. My breath caught. For a second I couldn't even process what I was looking at. I tapped the photo, zoomed in, hoping stupidly that I was wrong. That it wasn't him. But it was. Every detail. Every angle. Every piece of proof I didn't want to see. The caption was worse. Finally escaped reality. I felt something inside me crack. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, devastating break. And at that exact moment, I heard small footsteps behind me. Mom! Liam's voice was soft, still sleepy. I quickly locked my phone, turning around before he could see my face. He stood there in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes, holding his favorite little dinosaur. Is Dad already at work? He asked. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. Because the truth was, I didn't know how to explain that his father wasn't at work. He wasn't busy. He wasn't stuck in traffic or caught in a meeting. He was somewhere in the middle of the ocean spending $35,000 with someone else. And he didn't even say goodbye. I did not answer Liam right away because I needed a second to breathe, to think, to decide which version of the truth an 8-year-old could handle without breaking his world the way mine had just shattered. So I forced a small smile and walked toward him, crouching down to his level, brushing his hair gently back from his forehead as if everything was still normal, as if the kitchen was not spinning around me, and I said that his dad had to leave early for work, that it was something important, something unexpected, and Liam nodded slowly like he was trying to understand, like he wanted to believe me, but then he asked the one question I was not ready for, the one that cut deeper than anything I had seen on that screen. He asked why his dad did not wake him up to say goodbye. And I felt my chest tighten because Daniel never missed that, not once, not in 8 years, no matter how early he had to leave. He would always step into Liam's room, always whisper something soft, always make sure his son knew he was there. And now there was nothing, just silence, just absence, just the lie I was trying to hold together with a calm voice and a steady face. I told Liam that his dad did not want to wake him because he looked so peaceful sleeping, and Liam gave a small smile at that. The kind that made me feel even worse because he believed it completely, because children always believe the best version of the people they love, and I stood up slowly, turning away before he could see the tears building in my eyes, telling him to get ready for school while I started breakfast, but the moment I faced the counter again, The reality came rushing back, the image, the ocean, the woman leaning into my husband like she belonged there, like she had taken my place without even asking. And I gripped the edge of the counter tightly, trying to ground myself, trying not to fall apart right there in front of my son. I needed to think, I needed to understand how this had happened, how long it had been happening, because this was not a mistake, this was planned, the money, the trip, the timing, everything lined up too perfectly for it to be anything else. And then another thought hit me, one that made my stomach drop even further. The account he used was not just any account, it was our joint savings, the one we had been building for years, the one we told ourselves was for emergencies, for the future, for Liam. And suddenly the number 35,000 was not just a number anymore, it had weight, it had meaning, it was years of discipline, years of saying no to small things so we could say yes to something bigger one day. And he spent it in a moment. Just like that, on a trip with someone else. I reached for my phone again, my fingers trembling as I opened the account details, scrolling through transactions, and the more I looked the worse it got. Smaller charges leading up to the big one, hotel deposits, travel fees, things I had never noticed before because they were spaced out, hidden in the noise of everyday expenses. And that was when it hit me, this was not new. This had been going on for a while, quietly, carefully, right under my nose while I was packing school lunches, paying bills, living a life I thought we were building together. And I felt something shift inside me, not just pain, not just anger, something colder, something clearer, because this was no longer confusion, this was betrayal, deliberate and calculated. And for the first time since I saw that photo, I stopped asking why and started asking what I was going to do next, because whatever came next, it was not going to be the version of me who kept trusting without question, not anymore. I did not cry after Liam left for school, not because I was strong, but because something inside me had gone completely still, like the kind of silence that comes right before a storm. And as soon as the front door closed behind him, I walked back into the kitchen, picked up my phone again and opened that photo one more time, forcing myself to look at it longer this time, to study every detail I had missed in the shock of the first moment, the background, the angle, the people around them, the logo on the side of the ship, because I needed more than emotion now, I needed facts. I zoomed in slowly, my fingers steady even though my chest felt tight. And that was when I noticed something I had missed before, the tag location, a luxury cruise line departing from Miami, currently somewhere in the Caribbean. And beneath it a username, the woman's account, public, open, like she had nothing to hide, like this entire situation was something she was proud of. I tapped into her profile and, within seconds, more photos loaded, more evidence, more pieces of a story I had never agreed to be part of. There were pictures from the airport 2 days ago, Daniel standing beside her luggage, smiling the same way he used to smile at me in photos, relaxed, easy, familiar, and my stomach turned because that meant he had left before he told me he would be working late. It meant every word from him in the last 48 hours had been carefully chosen, deliberately false. And as I scrolled further, I saw something that made my hand stop completely, a short video clip, posted just a few hours earlier. The two of them standing on the deck, the ocean stretching endlessly behind them, wind moving through her hair as she laughed, and Daniel leaning closer, saying something I could not hear, but I did not need to hear it because I knew that look, I knew that tone. I had lived with it for 10 years, and suddenly I felt something rise in my chest again, not panic, not confusion, but clarity, sharp and undeniable. This was not an accident, this was not a mistake, this was a choice he had made again and again, every step of the way, and I had been the only one unaware. I closed the app slowly, my reflection faintly visible on the dark screen, and for a second, I barely recognized the woman looking back at me, because she was not the same person who woke up that morning believing her life was intact. She was someone else now, someone who had seen the truth and could not unsee it, someone who had a child to protect and a future that suddenly looked very different. I walked over to the table where Liam had left his backpack, still unzipped, one of his notebooks slightly sticking out, and I fixed it without thinking, smoothing the edges, zipping it closed, doing the small things that made life feel normal even when it was not. And that was when another realization settled in, heavier than the rest. Daniel did not just leave me, he left him too. He left an 8-year-old who would come home later asking the same questions, waiting for the same voice, expecting the same presence that would not be there. And I felt my jaw tighten because whatever the situation was, whatever Daniel thought he was doing out there in the middle of the ocean, he had underestimated one thing completely. He had underestimated me, because I was not going to sit here and wait for him to come back with excuses. I was not going to pretend this could be ignored or explained away. I walked back to the counter, picked up my phone again, and this time instead of calling him, I opened a new note, my mind already organizing everything I had seen, every transaction, every timestamp, every piece of proof, because if he thought he could disappear for a week and return to the same life he walked away from, then he had no idea what was waiting for him when he came back. And for the first time since this started, I felt something steady beneath the pain, not revenge, not anger, something stronger, something controlled, because this was no longer about what he did, it was about what I was going to do next. I did not move for a long time after that, not because I did not know what to do, but because I was thinking about him, about Liam, about the moment he would walk through that front door later that afternoon and look around the house like he always did, expecting to hear his father's voice somewhere in the background, expecting everything to be exactly the same as it was yesterday, and I knew that I could not let this situation turn into something that would quietly hurt him without explanation. I could not let Daniel's absence become a confusion that slowly turned into doubt inside our son, so I forced myself to shift my focus not to Daniel, not to the woman on that ship, but to Liam, because he was the only thing that actually mattered in this moment. I walked into his room slowly, the bed still unmade, his blanket half on the floor, a small pile of toys near the corner where he had left them the night before, everything frozen in a normal morning that no longer existed, and I picked up the blanket, folding it carefully, smoothing it out like I was trying to restore some kind of order, even if it was only temporary, and as I stood there, I noticed something on his desk, a drawing, simple, colorful, done with the uneven lines of a child, and when I picked it up, my chest tightened again because it was the three of us, drawn holding hands, Daniel on one side, me on the other, and Liam in the middle, smiling wide, the word family written above in slightly crooked letters, and I felt my throat close for a second because that was the version of the world Liam still believed in, the version that had just been quietly broken without him even knowing, and I sat down on the edge of his bed, holding that piece of paper, realizing that whatever I was feeling right now, whatever anger or betrayal was building inside me, it could not be what guided my next steps, because this was not just about a marriage anymore, it was about protecting a child from a reality he was not ready to understand. I placed the drawing back carefully, exactly where I found it, and stood up, taking a slow breath as I walked out of the room, closing the door gently behind me, and as soon as I stepped back into the hallway, my phone buzzed in my hand, a notification, and for a second my heart jumped because I thought it might be Daniel finally calling back, finally realizing what he had done, but when I looked down it was not him, it was a new post from her account, and I hesitated for just a moment before opening it, telling myself I needed to see everything, I needed to understand the full picture, and the video started playing instantly, the camera moving across the deck, the ocean stretching endlessly in every direction, sunlight reflecting off the water, everything looking perfect, almost unreal, and then it shifted to them again, Daniel standing there, holding two drinks, handing one to her as she laughed, her voice light, carefree, like nothing in the world could touch her, and I listened carefully this time, focusing on every word, every detail, and that was when I heard it, clear enough that there was no way to misunderstand. She asked him how long he could stay away before things got complicated back home, and Daniel smiled, relaxed, completely at ease, and said, "Long enough for it not to matter." And the moment those words settled in my mind, something inside me changed completely, because until that second, a part of me had still been holding on to the idea that this was temporary, that maybe there was some explanation, some misunderstanding, something that could be untangled, but there was not. There was only a man who had made a decision, who had chosen distance not just from me, but from his own son, and who believed that the life he left behind would still be there waiting for him when he decided to return. And I slowly locked my phone, my grip steady, my thoughts clearer than they had been all day, because now I understood something important. This was not just betrayal, this was abandonment, and whatever came next, it was not going to be built on waiting or hoping, it was going to be built on action, careful, deliberate, and impossible for him to ignore when he finally stepped back into the life he thought he could pause and resume whenever he wanted. I did not wait long after that moment, because waiting had already cost me more than I realized, and the longer I stood still, the more I felt like I was giving him time he did not deserve, so I walked back to the kitchen, set my phone down on the table, and opened my laptop instead, the screen lighting up the quiet room as if nothing had changed, as if this was just another ordinary day, but it was not, and I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I logged into our shared accounts again, slower this time, more carefully, not just looking but documenting, taking screenshots of every transaction, every charge tied to that trip, organizing them by date, by amount, by description, because this was no longer about confronting him emotionally, this was about understanding the full extent of what he had done, and the deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became. The cruise payment was not a single decision, it was the final step in a series of deliberate choices, smaller bookings weeks earlier, reservations, add-ons, upgrades, things that required planning, things that required intention, And all of it had been hidden behind the normal flow of our daily expenses, hidden while I was grocery shopping, paying bills, making sure our son had everything he needed. And I felt that same cold clarity settle in again, stronger now, more focused, because this was not just betrayal of trust, this was misuse of responsibility, and I could not ignore that, not when it affected Liam's future. I opened another tab and pulled up the savings account history, the one we had both agreed was for him, for his education, for emergencies, for the things that actually mattered, and I traced the withdrawals one by one, watching the balance drop, feeling the weight of each number, each decision Daniel had made without even considering the impact beyond his own immediate wants. And for a moment I closed my eyes, not to escape, but to steady myself, because I knew what I was about to do would change everything. I picked up my phone again, but this time I did not open his messages, I did not call, I went somewhere else, somewhere he would never expect me to go first. I opened the contact list and scrolled until I found a name I had not used in a long time. A number tied to a part of my life I had kept separate from our marriage, someone who understood financial structures, legal boundaries, someone who would see this situation clearly without emotion clouding the facts. And my finger hovered over the call button for just a second, not because I was unsure, but because I understood the weight of crossing that line once I made this call. There was no pretending this was something that could be quietly resolved, no going back to the version of life I had before this morning, and then I pressed it, holding the phone to my ear as it rang, each second stretching just enough to remind me that this was real, that everything had already changed. And when the voice on the other end finally answered, calm, professional, familiar, I introduced myself again, explained that I needed advice, not emotional support, not reassurance, but clarity. And as I began to describe the situation, the numbers, the transactions, the missing funds, I could hear my own voice changing, becoming steadier, more precise, because saying it out loud made it undeniable, made it something that existed outside of my own thoughts. And when I finished, there was a brief pause, just long enough to tell me that the situation was as serious as I believed. And then the response came, measured, direct, outlining steps I had not fully considered yet, options I did not know I had. And for the first time since I saw that first image, I felt something shift again, not pain, not anger, but control, because now this was not just something happening to me, this was something I was actively responding to, something I was shaping with intention. And as I ended the call, placing the phone back on the table, I realized something important. Daniel thought he had left his responsibilities behind when he stepped onto that ship, but he had not. He had only delayed the moment he would have to face them, and when that moment came, it was not going to be quiet, it was not going to be easy, and it was definitely not going to be something he could ignore. By the time I picked Liam up from school that afternoon, I had already made 3 calls, organized every document I needed, and written down a plan so clear that even I was surprised by how calm I felt, because earlier that morning I was still trying to understand what had happened, but now I was already preparing for what would happen next. And as Liam ran toward me outside the school building, smiling, waving his small hand like he always did, I bent down and hugged him a little tighter than usual, not because I wanted to show him something was wrong, but because I needed to remind myself what I was protecting, what all of this was really about. And he pulled back slightly, looking at me with that same innocent curiosity, asking again if his dad would be home for dinner. And this time I did not answer right away, not because I did not know what to say, but because I was choosing my words carefully. I told him that his dad was away for a few days, that he had to handle something important, and Liam nodded slowly, accepting it without question, because children trust explanations when they come from someone they feel safe with. And as we walked to the car, he started talking about his day, about a math test, about a friend who traded snacks with him at lunch, about small things that felt normal and light. And I listened, really listened, because those moments mattered more now than ever. They grounded me, reminded me that even if one part of my life had fallen apart, this part was still real, still steady, still worth everything I was about to do. And when we got home, I followed the same routine, unpacking his backpack, helping him with homework, making dinner, keeping everything as normal as possible, because I did not want his world to shift just yet, not until I had control over what came next. And later that evening, after Liam was asleep, after the house finally went quiet again, I returned to the table where my laptop was still open, the documents still laid out exactly how I left them, and I reviewed everything one more time, every transaction, every timeline, every piece of evidence, making sure there were no gaps, no uncertainties, because if I was going to move forward, I needed to be precise, I needed to be prepared. And then I did something Daniel would never expect. I opened my email and began drafting a message, not to him but to someone connected to the structure of his life, someone who would not ignore what I had to say, someone who would recognize the implications of financial misconduct, because this was no longer just a personal issue. It was something that crossed into responsibility, into accountability, and as I wrote, my words were calm, direct, supported by the documents I had collected, outlining exactly what had happened without exaggeration, without emotion, just facts, and when I finished, I did not send it right away. I read it again slowly, making sure every detail was correct, making sure there was no room for dismissal or doubt, and then I saved it, not because I was hesitating but because timing mattered, because I understood now that this situation was not about reacting quickly, it was about acting strategically, and as I closed my laptop, the room falling into silence again, I realized something I had not fully understood before. Daniel believed distance would protect him, that being out there, far from home, far from consequences, would give him control over when and how he faced reality, but what he did not know was that everything was already moving, quietly, steadily, and by the time he decided to come back, the version of life he left behind would no longer be waiting for him in the way he expected. The next morning I did not rush, I did not panic, and I did not reach for my phone to check if he had called, because by then I already knew he would not yet, not until it was convenient for him, and that realization no longer hurt the way it did before. It only confirmed what I had already accepted, that whatever connection we once had, it was not something he was holding on to anymore, and I refused to be the only one carrying it, so instead I focused on execution. I woke Liam up for school, made his breakfast, listened to him talk about a science project he was excited about, and I smiled at the right moments, responded when needed, because this part of my life still deserved consistency, still deserved stability, and after I dropped him off, I returned home with a very clear purpose. I walked straight to my laptop, opened the draft email I had written the night before, and this time I did not hesitate. I read it once more slowly, making sure every detail was accurate, every attachment properly labeled, every statement supported by evidence, and then I sent it just like that, no dramatic pause, no second-guessing, just a quiet, deliberate action that set everything into motion, and for a few seconds I simply sat there staring at the screen, not waiting for a reply but acknowledging what I had just done, because that message was not just information, it was a signal, it was the beginning of consequences. And then I closed the laptop and stood up, moving through the house with a calm I had not felt the day before, because now there was structure, now there was direction, and I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I gathered a small folder I had prepared, copies of financial statements, account summaries, transaction records, everything organized neatly, and I placed it into my bag, because there was one more step I was not going to delay, one more conversation that needed to happen in person, not over the phone, not through email, but face to face, where details could not be ignored or dismissed. And as I drove across town, the city moving around me like any other day, I realized how strange it felt that the world continued normally while everything in mine had shifted so completely. And yet I did not feel lost anymore. I felt focused, like every decision I was making was aligning towards something clear and necessary. And when I finally parked and stepped out of the car, I took a deep breath, not because I was nervous, but because I understood the weight of what I was about to do. I walked into the building, greeted the receptionist calmly, asked for the person I needed to speak with, and when I was told to wait, I sat down, my hands resting lightly on the folder in my lap, steady, controlled, not shaking anymore, because I was no longer reacting to what Daniel had done, I was responding to it with intention. And after a few minutes I was called in, the door closing behind me as I stepped into the office, placing the folder gently on the desk in front of me, and as I began to speak, explaining the situation clearly, outlining the facts without emotion, I could see the shift in the other person's expression, the moment where this stopped being just another conversation and became something serious, something that required attention, and that was when I knew without a doubt that everything Daniel thought he could leave behind was already catching up to him, even if he was still out there surrounded by ocean and sunlight, believing he had more time, because the truth was time was already working against him, and by the moment he realized it, the outcome would already be unfolding in ways he could not control. By the time I walked out of that office, I could feel it. The shift had already begun, not loud, not visible to anyone else, but real, structured, irreversible, and for the first time since this all started, I was no longer reacting to Daniel's choices, I was ahead of them, and that difference mattered more than anything. I drove home in silence, not turning on the radio, not checking my phone, just letting my thoughts settle into place, because everything I had set into motion needed time to unfold, and rushing now would only disrupt what I had carefully built. And when I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had, calm, ordinary, untouched by everything happening beneath the surface, and I stepped inside, placing my bag down slowly, moving through the familiar space with a new awareness, because I knew this version of normal was temporary, and I was the one deciding how it would change. Later that evening, as I sat at the kitchen table going over Liam's homework with him. My phone buzzed softly beside me, and I did not reach for it right away, not because I was avoiding it, but because I was choosing when to engage. And when I finally picked it up, the name on the screen made my chest tighten just slightly. Daniel. And for a brief second I just looked at it, letting the moment exist exactly as it was, because this was the first time he had reached out since everything began, the first time he had stepped back into the space he had left behind. And I answered calmly, bringing the phone to my ear without saying anything at first, letting him speak, and his voice came through relaxed, casual, almost distracted, like he was calling from a place where nothing was wrong, where everything was still under his control. He asked how things were at home, asked if Liam was doing okay, as if those questions alone were enough to cover his absence, and I listened, not interrupting, not reacting, just taking in every word, because now I could hear something I had not noticed before, the distance, not physical but emotional, the way he spoke like he was checking in on something temporary rather than something he was responsible for. And when he paused, waiting for my response, I answered in the same calm tone, telling him that everything was handled, that Liam was fine, that there was nothing he needed to worry about at the moment. And there was a brief silence on the line, the kind that comes when someone senses something has changed but cannot quite identify what it is. And then he asked a question that confirmed everything. He asked if I was upset, and I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it showed how little he understood the situation, because this was no longer about being upset, it was about clarity, it was about decisions that had already been made, actions that had already been taken. And I told him no, not upset, just focused, and I could hear the shift in his breathing, subtle but noticeable, like he was trying to recalibrate, trying to figure out where he stood without directly asking. And before he could say anything else, I ended the call gently, not abruptly, not emotionally, just with a simple statement that we would talk. When he got back, and as I placed the phone down, I realized something important. He still believed this was a conversation waiting to happen, something that could be explained, adjusted, maybe even smoothed over. But what he did not realize was that the outcome was already forming, already taking shape in ways he could not control, and when he finally returned, he would not be stepping back into the same life he left. He would be walking into the consequences of every decision he thought he could keep separate from reality. He came back on a quiet Sunday afternoon, like nothing had happened, like the last few days were just a short pause in a life he expected to resume without consequence. And I heard the sound of his car pulling into the driveway before I saw him, the engine shutting off, the door closing, footsteps approaching the house with a familiarity that no longer felt the same. And for a moment, I stood still in the living room, not tense, not emotional, just aware, fully aware of what this moment represented. And when the door opened and he stepped inside, carrying his bag, looking slightly tired but otherwise unchanged, his eyes met mine, and I saw it immediately, the expectation, the assumption that this would be a conversation. Something he could explain, something that could be managed, and he started speaking right away, saying my name, asking how things were, as if we were picking up from where we left off, but I did not respond right away. I let the silence sit between us just long enough for him to feel it, just long enough for him to realize that something had shifted beyond what he anticipated. And then I told him calmly that Liam was in his room, that he had been asking about him, and Daniel nodded, almost relieved, like that part of his life was still intact, still accessible, and he moved as if to go upstairs, but I stopped him with a single sentence, telling him that we needed to talk first, and that was when I saw the hesitation, the small flicker of uncertainty that had not been there before, and he set his bag down slowly, turning back toward me, trying to read my expression, trying to understand what he was walking into, and I did not raise my voice, I did not accuse, I simply laid everything out, the transactions, the account, the money taken from Liam's fund, the timeline, the evidence, each detail placed clearly between us, undeniable, structured, leaving no space for confusion or denial. And at first, he tried to respond the way I expected, with explanations, with partial truths, with attempts to redirect the focus, but none of it held, none of it fit against the facts I had already gathered. And the more he spoke, the more it became clear that this was not a misunderstanding, it was exactly what it looked like. And when he finally stopped, when the room fell quiet again, I told him what mattered most, not about the trip, not about the woman, but about Liam, about the responsibility he had stepped away from, about the future he had compromised without hesitation. And for the first time since he walked in, he did not have an immediate response, because this was not something he could deflect or minimize, this was something real, something that affected more than just us. And then I told him the part he was not expecting, that steps had already been taken, that the situation was no longer contained within this house, that the decisions he made had already set other things in motion, and I watched the Realization settled in slowly, heavily, as he understood that this was not a private issue anymore, that it had extended beyond what he could control, and he asked what I meant, his voice no longer steady, and I answered simply, telling him that the consequences of his choices were already unfolding, and that what happened next would not depend on explanations or apologies, and as the silence returned once more, heavier this time, I realized something I had not fully felt until that exact moment. I was no longer waiting for him to understand, I was no longer hoping for him to fix what he had broken. I had already moved forward, already made the decisions that needed to be made, and later that night, after everything had been said, after Liam had come downstairs and hugged his father without knowing any of it, without seeing the shift that had taken place, I sat beside him as he talked about his day. His voice light, his world still intact, and when he looked at me and said quietly that it was okay if his dad had to be away sometimes, that we would be fine, I felt a calm settle over me that was stronger than anything else because he was right, we would be fine, not because nothing had